There are so many strong moves and combat tricks you can do in God of War Ragnarok to truly become an unstoppable machine. Today we're gonna take a look at some of my favorite skills that you might have not used as much as you should. As always, a sub to the channel would be great, and let's dive right in. Now, one of my favorite combos is the Glacial Rake and Frozen Breach into Glacial Permafrost that, if you pull off correctly, will stun enemies, apply the frost status effect, and even fill your entire weapon gauge. Plus, with a proper build, it can end up further buffing your damage and even healing you on every hit. I'm going to explain the basic combo and then go over its more complex variant. So here is the early on version. The best way to do it early on is to preemptively charge your axe with the Frost Awaken triangle skill before any encounter, and then unleash the Frozen Ascent with the R2. From this point on, I always like following up immediately with a Glacial Rake by simply holding down R1. In the starting hours, this will fill your axe gauge very quickly, but there's ways to make it even faster. One of them is what I did, which is choosing the momentum mods once these skills reach the gold tier, so they greatly increase the permafrost charge when using them. The second thing, and even more important, is to get the Frost Awaken rank 2 and especially rank 4, which now let you instantly cast Frost Awaken both during sprinting as well as right after an axe attack. The sprinting one is pretty self-explanatory, and if you run then press triangle, it's going to activate that almost instantly. For the one that can activate after any attack, you will know when it's time to tap triangle as Kratos enters this ready mode where he pulls the axe outwards, so this is the time to quickly tap triangle and have the axe rearmed. And if you time this animation right, you can even rearm the axe back to back after every single Frozen Ascent, which will then give you another Frozen Ascent and so on. If you do this properly, you can basically get an infinite number of these as long as there's nothing to interrupt you. This will quickly build up the gauge, and I highly recommend focusing on another skill with the L1 and triangle, which is called the Glacial Permafrost, as well as its alternative for the blades. So now all of your melee attacks also unleash waves of frost damage for about 10 seconds that deal damage from range, on top of the fact that these can also be buffed by certain items to deal more damage and also heal you. I have a build ready for that, so if you want to see it, totally let me know down below in the comments. By the way, the Blades of Chaos also have their own variant with the emulation upgrades, and another trick is that you can actually charge any of these weapons and then switch to the other ones and still have the L1 plus triangle. For example, in this case, I built the emulation faster with the blades, and then I immediately switched to the axe, which let me activate the permafrost instead, even though previously I did not build any permafrost on that axe. Oh, and don't worry if you accidentally switch the weapon while L1 plus triangle is active, you can simply switch back to it as long as it didn't expire yet and continue to use it that way. But we were talking about the Blades of Chaos, and this is always my go-to option whenever I'm fighting large groups of enemies, especially small ones or annoying ones that jump all over the place, as this has the highest range. But one of the best skills in there provides some of the highest stun and highest damage, and this is going to be called the Hyperion Grapple rank 1. This upgrade lets you launch yourself towards the enemy by holding R1 instead of having the enemy pulled at you when tapping it. The reason I like this more is because the damage and especially that stun is one of the highest of all blades right now in the game. It can fill anywhere between 25 to 75% of the stun bar in just one single hit. That's why I recommend even going with a stun mod on some of these skills to make sure that the stun is even better than default. Also, at the point of impact, you will create a pretty large shockwave that further affects nearby enemies, so it's a great way to launch yourself into a literal group and just go wild. Its best feature is also the ability to interrupt many of the red unblockable attacks, so it's a smart way to jump from one enemy to another and leave everybody interrupted. But moving on, obviously these tricks can take a bit of setup, so you will want to be on your toes and nail down your parries. It mostly boils down to practice and learning attack patterns, so for that I highly recommend going to Niflheim and just practicing against the various mobs in there. But there's a few pointers that are still super useful before we move on to the shield options. So first, do not rely on the yellow ring indicator to time your parries, because that one only indicates the start of the animation, not when it actually lands. In fact, most enemies will first do a wind up before telegraphing and landing the attack, so you'll just press the button way too soon and get hit anyway. Instead, give it just a split second and wait until the very last moment before you unleash your parry. 9 times out of 10, you'll have a lot more success doing it this way. Another thing to be mindful of is that many of the enemies also do longer combos, which chain further attacks into one another. In this case, only the first one would be indicated with a yellow marker, while the remaining ones will not, since they are considered surprise attacks. So in this case, what you have to do is to basically parry every single one at every single step. So just pay attention to when they hit, as otherwise you can't escape the combo and are pretty much left exposed to almost getting one-shotted. That's why the shield choices are very important here, and while I will make a bigger breakdown in a different video, here are my favorite options. In my opinion, the best is definitely the Dauntless Shield. Even though the game mentions it's a high risk, high reward, in reality it's not, it's mostly just reward. It blocks just as well as any other shield in the game. The difference is that it has by far the best parry, which deflects melee attacks, and also the best follow-up counter attack, which has an insane stun that can literally one-shot stun any enemy. It also reflects projectile like most of the small shields as well. The stone wall, on the other hand, is a bit more beginner friendly since it's mostly aimed at blocking, but as I've said, the Dauntless can do that too. This further fills a meter next to the weapon gauge so that you can unleash that pent up energy whenever you want in a pretty large AoE all around you. But the downsides are pretty big. One of them is the fact that you cannot deflect like how you can do with the smaller shields, and neither can you reflect projectiles back at their targets, which I say is a pretty big letdown. The Guardian Shield is kind of like somewhere in between, except it also has a different follow-up with the L2, which is pretty unique to it. You kind of do this slam into the ground that can be quite useful, but it's not as strong as the counterattack from the Dauntless. And finally, there's the Shatterstar and the Onslaught. They kind of behave similar to the Guardian Shield, except they have their own certain quirks. Like the Shatterstar lets you charge the shield as long as you hold the button down, and after like a couple of seconds you can knock it to unleash a wave of damage in front of you. This is not going to be as well high range as the one from the stone wall, mind you. Onslaught, on the other hand, is one of the more uniques, as double tapping L1 lets you run towards the next target, blocking any frontal damage before slapping the heck out of that enemy. Again, probably not the best gap closer, as I've said, the Hyperion pull is definitely better. Now obviously there's so much parrying you can do before a hit eventually does land on you, and you definitely don't want to be caught off guard on the receiving end of a devastating blow, which is why it's probably smart to invest at least some points into the defense stat. Unlike Vitality, which just increases the number of hit points that you have, this one actually makes enemy hits on you to deal significantly less damage, and in the long run this stat will keep you alive for much longer. In this footage I had about 349, which I found to be slightly too high, but there's just something about taking a direct hit from a powerful strike only for it to deal minimum damage compared to what it could normally do. But speaking of doing stuff, let's talk about weapon switching, which is also extremely strong. This ability right here between the Vaporized Frost and Extinguished Flame, which we talked about previously, the buff that they provide to the other weapon can more than double your damage output. Like for example, if you were to freeze a target with the axe and then immediately switch to the blades instead, you will notice that the damage that you deal on their HP is now significantly higher than ever, as opposed to how it is normally with the blades, which barely even scratches this target. But moving on next, it's time we talk about invulnerability frames, or iframes for short, especially if you come from a Souls game like Elden Ring. The dodge is one of the skills that does have a fraction of a second of iframe right at the start of the animation, but just keep in mind that this will not let you dodge roll into enemy attacks if you were wondering that. The only exception that I know of are some of the attacks that come straight from above, including from some of these bosses that affect the whole arena in a high AoE range, but that was the only one that I was able to find. Another one would be, and this is the true only one with the iframes, is the R3, aka the stun grabs. And this is the only one that gives you full iframes for the entire duration. So in this case, you will want to stun enemies, keep them on the side, and in case you're running into trouble, to always go back to them, perform an R3 animation, and just be immune for the entire duration. Meanwhile, for the runic attacks, even though it would sound intuitive for them to have iframes, they actually don't, but what they do give is immunity to stuns and throwbacks. So you're basically kind of staying in place when you're doing those animations, but this can be a double-edged sword. So if you were to use this ability at the right time, this means you can unleash a massive attack uninterrupted. But if you unleash it just as the enemy is about to attack you, then you're going to just take the full attack to the face, which in many cases can even down you during that animation. Just be mindful of that and you should be good. But yeah, this is pretty much it with the biggest combat tips and tricks. Let me know down below if there's any that you know. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.